Hi guys, so today we are going to read the first part of chapter 8 in The Great Gatsby, but before we do that, I just want to review chapter 7 really briefly. So in chapter 7, some major things that happened. Gatsby and Daisy's relationship is pretty much out in the open. When they confront Tom about this, Gatsby wants Daisy to tell Tom that she's never loved him, but she admits that this is something that she can't say because it just wouldn't be true, which kind of leaves Gatsby upset. After the whole group makes their way back to their home, the Buchanan home, on the way, we know that the car that hits Myrtle is Gatsby's car, but Gatsby was not driving it. It was Daisy who was driving it, which he shares with Nick later when he sees him. Gatsby is also waiting outside of the Buchanan household because he is worried that Tom may do something to Daisy. But right before Nick leaves, when he goes up and looks in the window, he notices that they're sitting together and they're talking, and it doesn't really seem like anything bad is going on. It kind of seems like they're communicating with each other more civilly, maybe than they had previously. So that's where the chapter leaves off because Nick leaves. Gatsby refuses to go with him. So now we're going to find out what happens in chapter 8. So this starts on page 147. I couldn't sleep all night. A foghorn was groaning incessantly on the sound, and I tossed half sick between grotesque reality and savage, frightening dreams. Toward dawn, I heard a taxi go up Gatsby's drive, and immediately I jumped out of bed and began to dress. I felt that I had something to tell him, something to warn him about, and morning would be too late. Crossing his lawn, I saw that his front door was still open, and he was leaning against a table in the hall, heavy with dejection or sleep. Nothing happened, he said wanly. I waited, and about 4 o'clock she came to the window and stood there for a minute, and then turned out the light. His house had never seemed so enormous to me as it did that night when we hunted through the great rooms for cigarettes. We pushed aside curtains that were like pavilions and felt over innumerable feet of dark wall for electric light switches. Once I tumbled with a sort of splash upon the keys of a ghostly piano. There was an inexplicable amount of dust everywhere, and the rooms were musty as though they hadn't been aired for many days. I found the humidor on an unfamiliar table with 2 stale dry cigarettes inside. Throwing open the French windows of the drawing room, we sat smoking out into the darkness. You ought to go away, I said. It's pretty certain they'll trace your car. Go away now, old sport? Go to Atlantic City for a week or up to Montreal. He wouldn't consider it. He couldn't possibly leave Daisy until he knew what she was going to do. He was clutching at some last hope, and I couldn't bear to shake him free. It was this night that he told me the strange story of his youth with Dan Cody. Told it to me because J. Gatsby had broken up like glass against Tom's hard malice, and the long secret extravaganza was played out. I think that he would have acknowledged anything now, without reserve, but he wanted to talk about Daisy. Okay, so now we know that Gatsby waited for a signal from Daisy, but nothing really ended up happening. He said at 4 o'clock in the morning, she came to the window, stood there for a moment, and then just turned out the light. So Gatsby returned home then. Nick is advising him to leave because he's worried that, with everything going on with the car, that they'll be able to trace it back to him, and then he'll be in lots of trouble for killing Myrtle. But he doesn't want to leave. He is still holding on to that hope of being with Daisy at the moment. And then we also find out that this is the day, I should say, when Gatsby tells Nick all the information about his real life and how he grew up and meeting Dan Cody and all of that stuff that we read previously. I think it was chapter 6 that we read that. Now we're going to learn a bit about Daisy and Gatsby and their past together. She was the first nice girl he had ever known. In various unrevealed capacities, he had come in contact with such people, but always with indiscernible barbed wire between. He found her excitingly desirable. He went to her house, at first with other officers from Camp Taylor, then alone. It amazed him. He had never been in such a beautiful house before, but what gave it an air of breathless intensity was that Daisy lived there. It was as casual a thing to her as his tent out at camp was to him. There was a right mystery about it, a hint of bedrooms upstairs more beautiful and cool than other bedrooms, of gay and radiant activities taking place through its corridors, and of romances that were not musty and laid away already in lavender, but fresh and breathing and redolent of this year's shining motor cars, and of dances whose flowers were scarcely withered. It excited him, too, that many men had already loved Daisy. It increased her value in his eyes. He felt their presence all about the house, pervading the air with the shades and echoes of still vibrant emotions. But he knew that he was in Daisy's house by a colossal accident. However glorious might be his future as J. Gatsby, he was at present a penniless young man without a past, and at any moment the invisible cloak of his uniform might slip from his shoulders. So he made the most of his time. He took what he could get, ravenously and unscrupulously. Eventually he took Daisy one still October night, took her because he had no real right to touch her hand. He might have despised himself, for he had certainly taken her under false pretenses. I don't mean that he had traded on his phantom millions, but he had deliberately given Daisy a sense of security. He let her believe that he was a person from much the same strata as herself, that he was fully able to take care of her. As a matter of fact, he had no such facilities. He had no comfortable family standing behind him, and he was liable at the whim of an impersonal government to be blown anywhere about the world. But he didn't despise himself, and it didn't turn out as he had imagined. He had intended, probably, to take what he could and go, but now he found that he had committed himself to the following of a grail. He knew that Daisy was extraordinary, but he didn't realize just how extraordinary a nice girl could be. She vanished into her rich house, into her rich, full life, leaving Gatsby nothing. He felt married to her. That was all. When they met again, 2 days later, it was Gatsby who was breathless, who was somehow betrayed. Her porch was bright with the bought luxury of starshine. The wicker of the settee squeaked fashionably as she turned toward him, and he kissed her curious and lovely mouth. She had caught a cold, and it made her voice huskier and more charming than ever, and Gatsby was overwhelmingly aware of the youth and mystery that wealth imprisons and preserves, of the freshness of many clothes, and of Daisy, gleaming like silver, safe and proud above the hot struggles of the poor. I can't describe to you how surprised I was to find out I loved her, old sport. I even hoped for a while that she'd throw me over, but she didn't, because she was in love with me too. She thought I knew a lot because I knew different things from her. Well, there I was, way off my ambitions, getting deeper in love every minute, and all of a sudden I didn't care. What was the use of doing great things if I could have a better time telling her what I was going to do? On the last afternoon, before he went abroad, he sat with Daisy in his arms for a long, silent time. It was a cold fall day, with fire in the room and her cheeks flushed. Now and then she moved, and he changed his arm a little, and once he kissed her dark, shining hair. The afternoon had made them tranquil for a while, as if to give them a deep memory for the long parting the next day promised. They had never been closer in their month of love, nor communicated more profoundly with another than when she brushed silent lips against his coat's shoulder, or when he touched the end of her finger gently, as though she were asleep. Alrighty, so we know this is where we find out a little bit of Gatsby and Daisy's relationship before he left. So he talks about how amazed he was by the amount of money that she had, which was very apparent when he went to visit her at her home. So the way that her home, obviously how big it was and how it was decorated and everything, he could tell that she came from a lot of money. And this is kind of where the lies started, because this is when he gives her this false sense of security that he is from the same social class that she is and would be able to provide all of these things for her But we know, obviously that wasn't true. He really didn't have any money. He didn't have much really to rely on at all. So obviously Daisy was his drive for all that he has accomplished so far in his life, which could be really sweet, but it could also be kind of creepy. Anyway, then he talks about the night before he left and how, they sat together silently for a very long time, almost to like create this memory together for them before he had to leave. And remember, we found out before that she had tried the day that he was leaving to go say goodbye to him, but her family stopped her from doing so. He did extraordinarily well in the war. He was a captain before he went to the front, and following the Argonne battles, he got his majority and the command of the divisional machine guns. After the armistice, he tried frantically to get home, but some complication or misunderstanding sent him to Oxford instead. He was worried now. There was a quality of nervous despair in Daisy's letters. She didn't see why he couldn't come. She was feeling the pressure of the world outside, and she wanted to see him and feel his presence beside her and be reassured that she was doing the right thing after all. For Daisy was young, and her artificial world was redolent of orchids and pleasant, cheerful snobbery and orchestras which set the rhythm of the year, summing up the sadness and suggestiveness of life in new tunes. All night the saxophones wailed the hopeless comment of the Beale Street Blues, while 100 pairs of golden and silver slippers shuffled the shining dust. At the grey tea hour, there were always rooms that throbbed incessantly with this low, sweet fever, while fresh faces drifted here and there like rose petals blown by the sad horns around the floor. Through this twilight universe, Daisy began to move again with the season. Suddenly, she was again keeping 6 dates a day with 6 men, and drowsing asleep at dawn with the beads and chiffon of an evening dress tangled among dying orchids on the floor beside her bed. And all the time, something within her was crying for a decision. She wanted her life shaped now, immediately, and the decision must be made by some force, of love, of money, of unquestionable practicality, that was close at hand. That force took shape in the middle of spring with the arrival of Tom Buchanan. There was a wholesome bulkiness about his person and his position, and Daisy was flattered. Doubtless there was a certain struggle and a certain relief. The letter reached Gatsby while he was still at Oxford. Okay, so while he was away, he actually was required to stay later than he was supposed to, than he had originally told Daisy. And she was upset and not really understanding why he couldn't come home. And this is when he's at Oxford. And she's questioning him in her letters to him, because she feels pressured by society, and we talked about that too before. She feels pressured by society to follow this certain path, and she's not sure if she's making the right decision by waiting for Gatsby. So eventually she kind of goes back to her old ways where she's going on lots of dates and seeing other men, and eventually then what really turns her life in a whole new direction is when Tom Buchanan comes around, because we know that she ends up marrying him. Okay. It was dawn now on Long Island, and we went about, opening the rest of the windows downstairs, filling the house with gold-turning light. The shadows of a tree fell abruptly across the dew, and ghostly birds began to sing among the blue leaves. There was a slow, pleasant movement in the air, scarcely a wind, promising a cool, lovely day. I don't think she ever loved him. Gatsby turned around from a window and looked at me challengingly. You must remember, old sport, she was very excited this afternoon. He told her those things in a way that frightened her, that made it look as if I was some kind of cheap sharper, and the result was she hardly knew what she was saying. He sat down gloomily. Of course, she might have loved him for just a minute when they were first married, and loved me more even then. Do you see? Suddenly he came out with a curious remark. In any case, he said, it was just personal. What could you make of that, except to suspect some intensity in his conception of the affair that couldn't be measured? He came back from France when Tom and Daisy were still on their wedding trip, and made a miserable but irresistible journey to Louisville on the last of his army pay. He stayed there a week, walking the streets where their footsteps had clicked together through the November night and revisiting the out-of-the-way places to which they had driven in her white car. Just as Daisy's house had always seemed to him more mysterious and gay than other houses, so his idea of the city itself, even though she was gone from it, was pervaded with a melancholy beauty. He left feeling that if he had searched harder, he might have found her, that he was leaving her behind. The day coach, he was penniless now, was hot. He went out to the open vestibule and sat down on a folding chair, and the station slid away and the backs of unfamiliar buildings moved by. Then out into the spring fields where a yellow trolley raced them for a minute with people in it who might once have seen the pale magic of her face along the casual street. The track curved, and now it was going away from the sun, which, as it sank lower, seemed to spread itself in benediction over the vanishing city where she had drawn her breath. He stretched out his hand desperately, as if to snatch only a wisp of air to save a fragment of the spot that she had made lovely for him. But it was all going by too fast now for his blurred eyes, and he knew that he had lost that part of it, the freshest and the best, forever. Okay, it goes back to Nick's narration a little bit, and that's where Gatsby tells Nick that he really doesn't believe that Daisy ever loved Tom. He thinks that she was just under pressure to say that because of Tom. So you can tell that he's still really holding on to this hope of this love that they had in the past and this relationship that they could grow together now as well. Goes back to the past then a little bit, and it talks about how Gatsby came back when Tom and Daisy were still on their wedding trip. So he goes to her hometown and walks down the streets they walk down, visits a few places. He's trying to find her, but obviously, he's unable to do that. So he leaves, and when he leaves, in his mind, he's thinking that he's lost her forever. It was 9 o'clock when we finished breakfast and went out on the porch. The night had made a sharp difference in the weather, and there was an autumn flavor in the air. The gardener, the last one of Gatsby's former servants, came to the foot of the steps. "I'm going to drain the pool today, Mr. Gatsby. Leaves will start falling pretty soon, and then there's always trouble with the pipes." "Don't do it today," Gatsby answered. He turned to me apologetically. "You know, old sport, I've never used that pool all summer." Remember that. I looked at my watch and stood up. 12 minutes to my train. I didn't want to go to the city. I wasn't worth a decent stroke of work, but it was more than that. I didn't want to leave Gatsby. I missed that train, and then another, before I could get myself away. "I'll call you up," I said finally. "Do, old sport. I'll call you about noon." We walked slowly down the steps. "I suppose Daisy'll call too." He looked at me anxiously, as if he hoped I'd corroborate this. "I suppose so. Well, goodbye." We shook hands and I started away. Just before I reached the hedge, I remembered something and turned around. "They're a rotten crowd," I shouted across the lawn. "You're worth the whole damn bunch put together." I've always been glad I said that. It was the only compliment I ever gave him, because I disapproved of him from beginning to end. First, he nodded politely, and then his face broke into that radiant and understanding smile, as if we'd been in ecstatic cahoots on that fact all the time. His gorgeous pink rag of a suit made a bright spot of color against the white steps, and I thought of the night when I first came to his ancestral home 3 months before. The lawn and drive had been crowded with the faces of those who guessed at his corruption, and he had stood on those steps, concealing his incorruptible dream as he waved them goodbye. I thanked him for his hospitality. We were always thanking him for that, I and the others. "Goodbye," I called. "I enjoyed breakfast, Gatsby." Up in the city, I tried for a while to list the quotations on an interminable amount of stock. Then I fell asleep in my swivel chair. Just before noon, the phone woke me, and I started up with sweat breaking out on my forehead. It was Jordan Baker. She often called me up at this hour because the uncertainty of her own movements between hotels and clubs and private houses made her hard to find in any other way. Usually her voice came over the wire as something fresh and cool, as if a divot from a green golf links had come sailing in at the office window. But this morning it seemed harsh and dry. "I've left Daisy's house," she said. "I'm at Hempstead, and I'm going down to Southampton this afternoon." Probably it had been tactful to leave Daisy's house, but the act annoyed me, and her next remark made me rigid. "You weren't so nice to me last night." How could it have mattered then? Silence for a moment. Then, "However, I want to see you." "I want to see you too." "Suppose I don't go to Southampton and come into town this afternoon." "No, I don't think this afternoon." "Very well. It's impossible this afternoon. Various." We talked like that for a while, and then abruptly we weren't talking any longer. I don't know which of us hung up with a sharp click, but I know I didn't care. I couldn't have talked to her across a tea table that day if I never talked to her again in this world. I called Gatsby's house a few minutes later, but the line was busy. I tried 4 times. Finally, an exasperated central told me the wire was being kept open for long distance from Detroit. Taking out my timetable, I drew a small circle around the 3:50 train. Then I leaned back in my chair and tried to think. It was just noon. Alrighty, so Nick says he didn't want to leave Gatsby, but when he does eventually leave him, he tells Gatsby that he's way better than that whole group put together, referencing Tom, Daisy, Jordan, okay? And he also notes that this is the only compliment that he has ever given him, because he says that he has disapproved of him from beginning to end, which makes sense. We know that he was skeptical of him at first. He did accept what he told him with the proof that Gatsby gave him, but then obviously, we found out that it wasn't quite true and that he still was hiding other things. So, we know that Nick does not like dishonesty because honesty is one of his cardinal virtues. So then we have a really short conversation between Nick and Jordan. They're not really getting along right now because of what happened the day before and how he didn't want to come inside the Buchanan house after everything that had happened, which I think is pretty understandable. Just want to go home, but she's not really happy about it. So it seems like their conversation is a bit tense, a little awkward maybe. So that's kind of where that ends. We know where Nick and Jordan sort of stand with each other. And then it ends with Nick trying to call Gatsby's house and being unable to get through. So that's the first half of chapter 8. We'll pick up then on page, we're stopping on 155. So we'll pick up on 156 next time. Have a great day, guys.